Okay. In the period between the two world wars, Jewish spokesmen occupied a prominent place as defenders of minority rights. Their activism was an extension of the Jews' 19th century interventions on behalf of their endangered kindred in Eastern Europe. But after World War I, there were three unique conditions. One, the creation of minority treaties guaranteed by the new League of Nations, the resistance of their governments bound by these obligations, and the vacillation of the treaty's authors and guarantors. Two, the development of a transnational minorities movement. And three, the special role of Germany, first as a partisan, then as an assailant of minority rights. Thus, the Jewish emissaries, Jewish representatives in these 2 decades, found themselves in a much more complex and increasingly ominous environment. There's still controversy over the origins and purpose of the minority treaties at the Paris Peace Conference, signed between 1919 and 1920, between the great powers and the new and enlarged states of Eastern Europe. Many works devoted to this subject still assert that there was a deal struck between Jewish emissaries in Paris and the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. According to this version, an elite group of West European Jews and American Jews elicited concessions from this powerful leader who, fearing repression and political disorder in Eastern Europe, created this new international system of minority protection. The reality, however, is far more complex. The minority treaties emerged from several clashing interests: divided victors, staunchly resistant East European states, a defeated but defiant Germany, and a mobilized world public, along with determined and persistent but divided Jewish emissaries. And in this volatile diplomatic milieu, there were also personality and policy clashes, global concerns, and unforeseen developments, as well as at all conferences, acute time pressure. The big three, Lloyd George, Wilson, and Georges Clemenceau, were all convinced that past efforts at minority protection had failed. And therefore they needed to stabilize the new Eastern Europe by, one, curbing opportunities for Soviet or German irredentism, two, restraining the new states from repressive behavior toward their populations, and three, preventing minorities from presenting intemperate demands. There were also significant differences. France, after all, had new clients wedged between Germany and Soviet Russia, and wanted to limit their sovereignty as little as possible. The U.S. and Britain warned against creating new Alsace and Lorraine. The U.S. and Britain wanted specific clauses in the treaties. The French only wanted pledges of good conduct from their allies. None of these three, and this is important, doubted their right and their power to dictate terms to these new states. And none of the three was free of domestic pressure when they were making these decisions. Now, the new East European states, which were brandishing their anti-German and anti-Soviet credentials, and incidentally had grabbed as much territory as they possibly can right after the war, denounced the proposed minority treaties as humiliating derogations on their sovereignty. The showdown occurred on May 30th, at one of the few plenary sessions in which their representatives accused the great powers of hypocrisy, of standing for the rights of minorities while refusing to have a universal system of minority rights. And they threatened to withhold their signatures. Now, their defiance, but also their weakness, all of these new states were at odds with their neighbors, were threatened by Germany and Soviet Russia. All of this brought the peacemakers back to the table to try to figure out what it was they wanted to do. Germany's role was also significant. The defeated Reich was now a republic, but it was the home of some 8 million unwilling subjects in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and the Baltic states. Wilson and his colleagues had no desire to grant these Germans any special privileges in the form of either political or cultural autonomy. But they all believed that some gesture would persuade Berlin to sign and would dissuade it from threatening its neighbors in the future. World public opinion was important. It had been mobilized both by Germany and by Jewish advocates, and it did exert a little pressure on the peacemakers, in particular between November 1918 and the spring of 1919. There were pogroms all over Eastern Europe, and these were widely publicized, and this gave an at least temporary boost to the protagonists of minority rights. Moreover, there were humanitarian organizations, women, socialists, pacifists, who all believed that the war should not only create new states, but also protect minorities. But these humanitarian sentiments, Jane Addams visited with Woodrow Wilson on this subject, but these had only a minor impact on the peacemakers because all three had vast empires. They had their own minority subjects. Balfour famously kept talking about the Chinese laundryman in Liverpool who would have no rights at all. What they were looking for was a pragmatic, minimalist solution to what they called a temporary eruption of violence. Now, the Jewish role is, of course, significant. It was conspicuous. Jewish advocates came from a dozen countries. They flocked to Paris with high hopes, and they attracted considerable attention. But they were also in parlous condition. They had been physically separated during the war. They were at odds over Zionism, and that's important because Zionism was taken up first at the peace conference in February. But no solution was found, and this was crucial. This was absolutely crucial. An important Jewish issue was left in suspense. They were also severely divided between the Western protagonists of limited political minority protection and the Eastern idea, the Comité des Délégations Juives, led by Leo Matzkin, who wanted extensive cultural and even national autonomy. Moreover, unlike many of the supplicants at Paris, they had no state backing them. I mean, Germany would have been worthless even if the Germans had come out in their favor, and they lacked political experience, and the rumor mill, and the difficulties, and the time frame all made things very difficult. Much credit has to go to two individuals, to the British journalist and longtime advocate Lucien Wolfe, and to the American attorney Louis Marshall. They were forceful and persistent. They agreed that the East European program was a non-starter, that they had to come up with a program that was acceptable to their governments. And so Wolfe and Marshall put together a program clothed in old-fashioned liberal rhetoric and also historical precedents. But the two men were also at odds with each other and rivals. The American, based on his assumption that the United States would dominate the post-war world, wanted to be very, very severe toward the East European states. Whereas the British spokesman, who had long dealt with East European leaders, knew that their cooperation was going to be essential for any effective system. Both of them, however, realized that what would be important would be once and for all to give the minorities some voice. In June 1919, the Big Three, who were facing a signing deadline with Germany, finally turned their attention to minority rights. They created an ominous-sounding Committee on New States, not a minority committee, and they produced history's first minority treaty with Poland. Unsurprisingly, the results fell far short of Jewish hopes. The 12 treaty articles, whose terms would be incorporated into the signatories' constitutions, into their administrative and legal practices, upheld the Western version of religious, political, and personal freedom and equality before the law. But the clauses relating specifically to minorities were either vague or weak. For example, the terms of citizenship left claimants vulnerable to expropriation, expulsion, and statelessness. And although the treaty mandated state support for minority elementary schools, it left it up to minorities to fund their own higher education and their major religious and charitable institutions from their own sources. More important, and this is always wrong, there was no recognition of group rights. Minorities were specifically referred to as individuals who used non-Polish languages, who had different religions, a different race as well, which was used a lot. They would have no representation on the local or the national level. The clauses pertaining to the Jews, although the Sabbath was recognized and no elections, were to be permitted on that day, there would be exceptions for military service and states of emergency. And what Wolff tried so hard to get and did not, Sunday trading, which was a key to the economic survival of Polish Jewry, was not included. Finally, the guarantee clause, and this is a biggie, represented only a minor change from the past practice. Instead of relying on signatories for enforcement, the responsibility for enforcing the treaties was placed with the Council of the brand new, as yet unborn, League of Nations and adjudication of differences to the International Court of Justice. But contrary to the hopes of both Wolff and Marshall, minorities were barred from appealing directly to the League. And it was unlikely, as in the past, that a council member would interfere in another country's internal affairs. So once more, the protection of Jewish minority rights would depend on Jewish intercessors. Jewish leaders nonetheless exulted in their accomplishments. Wolff and Marshall announced a new era of minority protection, although both acknowledged the danger of noncompliance and backlash. Indeed, Poland, despite the Allies' many concessions, including the fact that Britain and America gave up their opposition and Poland was able to sweep into eastern Galicia, take the whole province without any protection, any special protection for its large non-Polish population, Poland only grudgingly signed, and its leaders were openly determined to get rid of this humiliating form of servitude. Moreover, Western public opinion turned against Jewish leaders, swung in another direction, accusing them of bullying the new states, linking Jews with the spread of Bolshevism, and urging their governments to restrict immigration from Eastern Europe. Thus, rather than a victory for Jewish diplomacy, the Polish Minority Treaty, which became the model for these other agreements, was thus an equivocal accomplishment. It was a historic development, but much depended on whether its authors actually intended to make these treaties, even in their modest form, more than a temporary stopgap measure to ease the transition in Eastern Europe. The League system. America's rejection of the Versailles Treaty undoubtedly crippled the development of the League of Nations. The two remaining members of the Big Three, Britain and France, neither shared Wilson's enthusiasm for the world's first international organization, nor agreed on its purpose and its operation, nor were very enthusiastic about minority rights. Compounding the difficulty was the fact that there were two hostile outsiders, Germany and Soviet Russia, which denounced the League as a wartime device. And then there were the smaller members and the global public that wanted a more robust organization because they contested what was left of the peace settlement. League bureaucrats carefully created a machinery to implement the minority treaties, one that its members immediately rejected. In fact, at the first council meeting, they wondered whether they couldn't dump it. But they could not escape the treaties without inciting both liberal public opinion and the minorities. Thus, the League system was born and laced with contradiction. The League allowed minorities to petition Geneva. This was a practice that was also adopted by the Mandates Commission, but with less brouhaha. But the circulation of petitions was limited. It was highly limited, and the specification for their admissibility was very narrow. Most appeals were thrown out without any notification to the petitioner. The second element was something called the Committee of Three. To alleviate the burden on individual members, the Council at each quarterly session appointed ad hoc committees of 3 members to examine petitions that had passed the Secretariat's narrow door. These meetings were held in secret. No official minutes were taken. They were steered by the League's minority director, and they generally disposed of most, but the most important, petitions by leading to what was called private and benevolent negotiations between the League and the accused government for the purpose of eliciting the minimum number of concessions to close the case. The minorities were not consulted at all. Although individual council members could still bring up a complaint until Germany joined the League in 1926, none ever did so. Thus, the League's procedure was an essentially conciliatory one. It rested heavily on a Geneva bureaucracy, young, ambitious international civil servants, but also people who were very practical in terms of not raising overweening expectations by minorities, not antagonizing the governments on whom all the pressure was falling, and not burdening council members when they had so many other important things to do. Now, this system went neither unnoticed nor uncontested. The minority states regarded every petition as a hostile gesture and immediately retaliated, because what they didn't want was any kind of fixed regime. Okay, the minorities and internationalist opinion chastised Geneva for its excessive secrecy and for limiting the entire procedure to petitions, for keeping it separate. The League Assembly, which was a much more democratic body, proposed two major improvements: to have a long-term permanent minorities commission on the model of the Mandates Commission, and to have a universal system of minority rights, neither of which would ever pass. It fell to Lucien Wolfe in the 1920s, when the United States dropped out, to try to make the Geneva system work. And the results there were really very, very disappointing. Lucien Wolfe tried, for instance, to interest the League in an Austrian law that disenfranchised thousands and thousands of Jews from Galicia, basically on racial grounds, that even though they were German-speaking, they were not of the German race. This is a case fraught with menace. He fought unsuccessfully against Greece, which refused to grant a Sunday trading. And his worst struggles were with Poland and with Hungary over the numerous clauses. Wolfe also trailed the League's minorities directors. He paid visits to Prague, to Warsaw, and to Budapest to try to negotiate with these governments, especially on the issue of statelessness. Also, interestingly enough, early on he established ties with the Weimar government in Germany. But he had to be very, very cautious about this, and it was only after 1926 that close ties developed between Wolfe and Berlin. It was then in 26 when Gustav Stresemann brought Germany into the League, and he sold League membership on the basis of the fact that he would go there and he would protect minority rights. However, this really led to very little. It's questionable, actually, what Stresemann wanted in Geneva. He really wanted to push the French out of the Rhineland. He really wanted concessions on reparations. Minorities were a very popular and a very useful lever against the Western powers. The sum total of Stresemann's minorities crusade before he died were through three very minor improvements in the procedure and a great deal of disappointment. Somebody wrote in 1929 that in the League Palace in Geneva there was a dark room where minority petitions disappeared. Now, in contrast to Wolfe and this discreet, behind-the-scenes diplomacy, and Louis Marshall did a little bit on his own side, economically and financially in the United States, there was another form of Jewish minority advocacy led by Leo Motzkin, the Kiev-born Zionist and nationalist, who decided to continue the idea of the Comité. In 1927, he infuriated British and American Jews by creating the Council of the Rights of Jewish Minorities in Geneva to lobby the League. But even more significant in Motzkin's career was his alignment in something called the European Congress of Nationalities, with German minority groups, with people like Amende and Schiemann and Wilfan, with the German advocates of cultural and national autonomy. This group held annual meetings. It published copiously on the condition of minorities, and Motzkin drew a fairly substantial subsidy from the German Foreign Ministry. After the deaths of Wolfe and Marshall in 1929, the Motzkin side began to take root. In 1932, Rabbi Stephen Wise in New York also defied the moderate line. He adopted the Nationalist program, and he formed the first World Jewish Conference, which was going to lay the basis of the World Jewish Congress. And despite the boycott of this and also the Zionists' misgivings over creating a rival organization and warnings of retaliation by hostile governments, in August 1932, 94 elected delegates from 17 countries, Jews, assembled in Geneva and declared themselves a unified people. And they dedicated themselves to ameliorating Jewish life in Eastern Europe and insisting that the League of Nations fulfill its obligations. The Nazi assault. January 1933, Hitler's accession to power led to a savage persecution of German Jewry in an attempt to remove them from life. And this split, everything Motzkin had tried to do. In fact, he dies at the end of this year. Because what happens then is that there's this movement for disassimilation of Jewry. German Jewry, which was unprotected except in Upper Silesia from any form of rights. And suddenly they're being told they are not part of the German polity, they must leave, they are not part of this. Motzkin responded by instigating a minority petition over Upper Silesia to the League, and in May a council meeting debated this, the famous Bernheim case. In fact, it was broadcast in the United States. In September, the League Assembly erupted with criticisms of Germany's persecution of Jews. Nazi Germany's exit from Geneva on October 14th spared any more debates in the League over German Jews. 1 year later, Poland emulated Berlin's defiance by refusing any cooperation with Geneva, and the League system collapses. The number of petitions sank. 1930-31, there were 204 petitions to Geneva. By 1938-39, there were 4. The League's minority section fell into a procession of mediocre directors with a shrinking staff and budget. Remember, it's the Depression. And Germany now dominates the scene. It preaches racial separation at home, German dominance abroad. It undermined the whole idea of collective security with its bilateral pacts with its weaker neighbors. In other words, minority rights was now something that would be dealt with through Berlin. And the international minorities movement that had been so robust in the 1920s collapsed. The Jews walked out, and the movement collapses, and even Berlin worried about that. Late, in 1936, the World Jewish Congress is founded in Geneva to combat anti-Semitism and to protect Jewish rights all over the world. But it was late. And it was divided, even then, between Zionists and anti-Zionists, between the assimilationists and the nationalists, and especially between moderates and militant spokesmen. Moreover, Western Jewry, the leaders, were now threatened with charges of communism and warmongering, and faced a flood of penniless refugees from Nazi Germany, and the doors of Palestine were about to close. And so the Jewish world faced a calamity unforeseen in 1919. The League continued to take a very narrow view of its role. Britain and France still hoped to bring Nazi Germany back to Geneva, and therefore they refrained from condemning these violations of minority rights, even when pressed by people like James MacDonald, the League's first and most active commission for the refugees fleeing Germany. The international problem was compounded by the fact that Germany's neighbors began to emulate the Nazis' racist policies. The right-wing governments of Poland, Hungary, and Romania, each with larger percentages of Jews than the Third Reich, prepared their own anti-Semitic legislation. And these actions were bolstered by the spread of popular anti-Semitism in the cities, in the universities, in boycotts, in segregated facilities, and in violence against property and individuals. For the British and French, who realized that the social chaos and the political chaos that they faced made them, to some extent, responsible, because they were, after all, the creators of these treaties that they either had to fulfill or abandon, or openly abandon. In December of 1937, the showdown took place over, of all places, Romania. Romania had intended now to end Jewish citizenship in the country systematically, to strip tens of thousands of Jews and drive them into exile. The League of Nations was unprepared to handle this urgent case. The right-leaning Secretary General Joseph Avenel was indifferent. The last minorities director of the League was pro-Nazi. And Romania was a council member and threatening to overthrow its own system. And what's interesting about this is that the League had no procedure to handle it. Instead, it was handled in a purely old-fashioned way, with pressure from London, Washington, and Paris. And even then, over a third of the Jews of Romania had lost their citizenship. Okay, quickly, conclusions, because I'm running out of time. It is easy to fault Jewish activists in the interwar period for failing to recognize either the futility of cautious minority diplomacy or public remonstrance. To be sure, these were brave, intelligent, and persistent individuals who were attempting to preserve a long tradition of Jewish advocacy, and they were acting under unprecedented conditions. It was a brand new world organization that was collapsing after 1931. There was a Nazi regime that totally transformed the whole idea of minority rights. And there were, signatory powers who had no desire to take over their responsibility. But even in the tranquil 1920s, there were fundamental problems in the whole issue of minority rights. The peacemakers had drawn up very questionable treaties and only as stopgap measures, and they had excluded the people who were concerned, which is very different, by the way, from the United Nations. They had excluded the people who were involved. Two, the League had established an essentially political procedure and a very, very narrow one. It combined a somewhat permissive aspect with the fact that the problem was fragmented and extremely limited. And third, of course, the whole idea of a universal system of minority rights, the universal system, which even people like Lucien Wolf refused because he knew his government would never accept it, Wolf and Marshall went about the old traditions of lobbying politicians, but they had insufficient knowledge of local first-hand conditions. They made very few, almost no alliances with other affected minority groups. Motzkin, on the other hand, was a very active member of the German Jewish alignment, a very active member. But, of course, the denouement came in 1933, when, except for Schliemann, all his old allies deserted him. Jewish diplomacy, Jewish defense of minority rights was weighed down by internal social and political traditions, by the struggle over Zionism. This was especially true in Motzkin, the struggle between Western and Eastern ideas of citizenship, and the whole issue of whether, in fact, a stronger minority, a stronger system, which they never came out and proposed, would have made a difference. Now, I'm not going to say anything more about after 1945 because that's going to come up on our next panel. Thank you.